bow your hearts with me for a word of prayer. Gracious God, give us humble, teachable, and obedient hearts, that we may receive what you have revealed and do what you have commanded. Amen.
Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea, and gathering fish of every kind, and when it was filled, they drew it up on the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish into containers, but the bad they threw away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth and take out the wicked from among the righteous, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? They said to him, Yes. And Jesus said to them, Therefore every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household, who brings out of his treasure things new and old.
We have reached the end of the parables of chapter 13. We were trying to think of how long we've been doing these. It seems like a long time, hasn't it? But there were just a lot of parables. So you should all be experts on them. Therefore, I don't have to explain anything, because you guys know it. You've heard them all. When I looked at this passage, I saw there were two short parables in it, and instead of elongating it out to 2 weeks, I thought we'd cover it in 1 week, because frankly, we've pretty well talked out the kingdom of heaven. We're pretty well versed on this. And it's a continuation. But that second parable is the one we're going to end up focusing on, because there's a real interesting twist in it. But the first one about the dragnet, understanding, and you should already know how fishermen caught fish in those days in the Sea of Galilee. They go out of the boat a few hundred feet. They just toss a net over, and then they sit. Now, they could be drinking beer or having, who knows what they're doing, but they don't. It's not like they move the boat or the net. But when it's time to bring in the harvest of the fish, if you will, the catch of the fish, I guess is the right word, they would leave the net in the water and bring the boat in, thus dragging the net. Dragnet. I was going to look up the old show and have that come on Dragnet, but then what they would do is they had some winches. They would pull the fish out of the water, put it down, usually in the boat, and then they would separate the fish. They would separate the fish they could sell from the fish they couldn't sell. Now, if those were still alive, you would hope that the fish they can't sell they threw back in, but we're not really sure. But the point is they separated, because you can't take to market bad fish. Who's going to buy the bad fish? So we have this little thing here, this story again, and again, it fits into all the other parables of the kingdom of heaven, that there's going to be this fishing of people, and eventually, at the end of time, there's going to be a separation. The question you could start to raise through these different parables could be, well, is the separation when people enter the kingdom of heaven, or is the kingdom of heaven going to engulf the earth and eventually God's going to separate people? That one you can go back and forth with, and there are going to be more stories coming along the way in parables that deal with that, because it mentions the gnashing of teeth, and the minute you hear gnashing of teeth, you all know we're talking about the end times. But the twist of this parable, which made people stand up and go, huh, was Jesus told them at the beginning, if you remember, that they were going to be fishers of men. But here the fisherman is actually God in the parable, because it says the fisherman's going to do the separating. Well, it's God who's going to separate the good from the bad. It's not something we could do. And it's very subtle, but it is there, and it would have made people stand up. And when you read all these parables, this is just the thought I had, is perhaps the author of Matthew decided to bring these all together in this one chapter. But I could see Jesus telling these over the course of 3 years, opposed to all of them at once. because they do get a little repetitious after a while. But it also tells us we have to hear things a lot, because we're not too bright to pick them up the first time, I guess. But that's the dragnet. The one with the scribes got some interesting things in it. And first I wanted to tell you about what scribes do, because that's important to understand this parable. If you go back to the time of the kings, so we're looking at David and Solomon and Jeroboam and Ahab and all those, scribes were actually managers of property, like financial advisors, and probably some of you have financial advisors. That's what they did. They were like the chief stewards. They took care of the money. And that was their job. And they were called scribes because they had to know how to read and write, because you got to pay the king's bills. You know, it's good to be the king that you don't have to worry about the bills, because the scribes took care of it. But during the exile time, there's no more kings. What do scribes do? Well, the people, if you remember, were taken into Babylon, into exile, into the capital city. They also were taken to a place called Susa. They were very concerned that their culture was going to be destroyed. And when Babylon moved them, they would start to be influenced by the people of the city. So the scribes, who were the managers, money managers at one time, who knew how to write, started to write things down. They wrote down the different ceremonies. They wrote down explanations that they had of Scripture. They didn't want the faith to disappear. And the only way to do that is to write things down. And it may have been one of the first of the religions to start writing things down. And when the people returned from the exile, they had documents, if you will, scrolls, to say, oh, what do we do on these special holy days? What do we do on these holidays? How do we bring the Sabbath in? How do we do? Well, there it was. Everything is nicely written. In Jesus' time, we identify the scribes as Pharisees. So when you hear scribe or Pharisee, really one and the same, at least from the New Testament author's point of view. And they were considered the guardians of, as I have it up there, the Torah and the laws. Why? Because they were writing it all down. They still continued writing. And in Jesus' day, there were two topics that were real hot, that got a lot of attention and an awful lot of writing. And the first one was the Sabbath. And the Sabbath law is the book in the Mishnahs, about yay thick. Of course, the Mishnahs about that thick. What can you and can't you do on the Sabbath? It's a huge question, because if you go back to the Ten Commandments, it simply says to keep the Sabbath holy, to not work. But what does that mean? What is work and what isn't work? What is toil and what is not toil? What do you have to do versus what can wait? And it still continues today. If you get a modern book of, it's called Halakha, you're going to find there's a whole section in there on modern things. Can you change your brakes on Saturday? Probably the answer is no to that. But the big one that I always laugh at, and I won't go through the whole thing, is if your toilet's flush, can you unstuff it? Well, there's a whole big rabbinical thing about this. So in Jesus' day, that's a hot topic. And there's a ton of writings that occur. So these Pharisees are there. Now, of course, you know they're writing about other things, and Jesus had some good points about what they were telling you can and you can't do. But when they got together, you know, the scriptures like to say, the New Testament Gospels, that they fought with him and they're trying to trap him. They really weren't doing that. They were debating what you can and can't do. What did this law mean? What did that law mean? Which was what they did in those days. And if you go into a yeshiva, which is a seminary for rabbinical students, you're going to find that's what they do. You go to the library and it's not quiet. You're going to hear a lot of debating. And people who don't understand that part of the culture say, oh, they're fighting with each other. No, they're not fighting. They're trying to find out, what do you think? What do I think? I'm going to convince you my way's right. You're going to convince me your way's right. That's what they do. They debate. So they were debating in Jesus' day. They were doing the exact same thing. And they want to find out, so Jesus, what do you think about the Sabbath? Because there were two major houses, if you will, of thought. And one was the house of Hillel, and they trained one way in the Sabbath, and the house of Shammai, who went a different route. and said, here's what you can and can't do. So these two houses are going after each other, not like purposely, it's just they believed in different things. There was one other topic that has a lot of writings that occurred in Jesus' day, and I asked the first group of folks here this morning, does anyone want to guess on that topic? It's one that pops up all over the gospel. It's there a lot. It's divorce. Divorce was a biggie. When can you do it? When can't you do it? How do you do it? Beyond what the law of Moses says, and you catch your wife in adultery or husband in adultery, that's the easy one. But there are more to go, more things about that you could do. And like, for example, the house of Shemati said that you cannot get a divorce except for adultery. But the house of Hillel said you could have what we call no-fault divorce. I just don't want to be married with you anymore and walk away. Well, that's a big thing. Now you go and look at what Jesus said about the divorce, and you can see which group he fits into, and he had some of his ideas. So beside the Sabbath being this thing, divorce became this thing. And they had all these rules and regulations. And a lot of their rules and regulations about all these other topics, yeah, some of them were very restrictive, and some of them really weren't, they weren't quite necessarily biblical. The twist here is the scribes were described through the Gospels as the Antichrist can be part of the kingdom. Now here's where it gets a little interesting, because, and you can take it a lot of different ways. Here's the net, right? You got the net. I'm going to go back to the net just for a second. You think about it, and you're pulling all these fish in, you're pulling the good and bad in. If you imagine for a second that that was the kingdom of heaven, the net, that means you got good and bad people in it. And the separation isn't going to occur till the end of time. That's one way to connect these two together and see the kingdom of heaven. But another way to look at it is when you're talking about scribes, you're talking about law. You're talking about Torah, you're now talking about God's Bible. So if we look at just this thing by itself, this final parable, I think he's saying that you have to know and understand Scripture in order to enter the kingdom. Because the definition Jesus uses for the kingdom of heaven, guess where it's found? It's all in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's all there. And people in those days knew their Scripture really, really well. So he's got all these parables about the kingdom, right? And this whole thing with the good, the bad people, and the gnashing of teeth and whatnot. You've got all that happening, and you got a lot of that, right? And now we come to the very last one of chapter 13, and what's it say? You better know your Scripture too. It's like, whoa. So I had to be told about being good and being bad like 13 times, but I only have to be told once about the Scripture, because this is so sacred that you all know that already. People in Jesus, they know they're supposed to know the Scripture. Remember, no internet, no Nintendo. What else are you going to do all day? Right? You get up, you work, you have dinner, you got a few hours, you study your script, you know it like the book. And the definition for us also is found in the New Testament, where I see Jesus as taking this stuff in the Hebrew Scripture and saying, let me explain it to you in nice, simple terms. And this is his terms, which match up, of course, with the old, because he came to fulfill the Scripture. That's how he does it. And you have to think about it for a second. I said this morning, so I'll say it again. I don't know if there's going to be a gate up there with St. Peter, but Christianity tends to believe that. It comes out of the Middle Ages. I mean, what happens if you get up to the gates and Peter starts asking you some questions? I don't know if he's going to be there or not. Mick asked me that after. He said, you said this. I said, no, I postulated this. I don't know what's going to happen up there. But if you want to know what the kingdom of heaven is and what pleases God, which is part of the kingdom of heaven, where are you going to find it? Well, it's in the manual called the Bible. And I think the author of Matthew closes out this section of the parables. We're done with them for a while. There's going to be more coming in about 12 or so chapters, so that's about 2023 or something like that. However we get to it. I think this is a good way to close it out by saying, read the scripture because all the definition you need is there. And we have the Gospels and the New Testament that gives us that further definition. And I think that's where we find the importance. So let's continue in our worship. We'll get prepared here. We'll have communion together.